handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er, 8 9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGBT, gas TOT 5-3U.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience, where we are so thrilled to be an affiliate to WJHC 107.5 FM, serving North Florida, and WLBB 1330 AM and 106.3 FM, serving West Georgia. We are very happy to be part of their radio train. And I would say that I also have the distinct honor, again, having Seton Motley with us of lessgovernment.org, who is somebody that I always kind of go to because we like to get into these minutia type debates that just seem to always be percolating out there but never get resolved. And so, Seton, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you very, very much.
One particular thing that hasn't seemed to go away, and you addressed it in an article, that is minimum wage. And I want to start off by saying this. I think minimum wage is something like, I don't know, $7.50 an hour, $7.25 an hour, the federal minimum wage. But that is not the case necessarily at the state and local level. But Seton, that is not what an employer pays, is it? They don't pay $7.25 an hour. It's really closer. The cost of that labor hour is closer to almost $11 an hour. Correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, it depends on where you are, of course. You got to pay payroll taxes too. You know, in an employer-employee situation, you know, the employee gets Social Security and Medicare taxes taken out and other taxes taken out. Well, the employer is mandated by law to match that. So that's another expense of hiring somebody. And, you know, there are other factors in various areas. You know, it's obviously we got 1,100 or something like that taxing jurisdictions in the United States, and each one has different, you know, requirements of employers and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, you purchase, you know, this is one of the things they don't understand about labor. You purchase labor.
You rent labor. That's correct.
Well, no, you rent, whatever. But I mean, you purchase labor. McDonald's purchases labor the way they purchase buns and burgers.
Correct.
And the higher you make the cost of purchasing buns or burgers or labor, the less buns, burgers, and labor McDonald's can purchase. Because it's not like they have these vast, you know, chests of gold sitting in the corporate offices waiting to spend when you come along and, you know, raise the minimum wage on these businesses. It has to come out of some other operational expense in the business.
That's right. And then I would also say that you also have to pay for others that are sick. So you've got sick time in there. And then I call them the lazy, because not everybody who is on the payroll at $7.25 an hour is going to give you $7.25 an hour worth of labor. They may give you $4 worth of labor, meaning that you got to go get somebody else to kind of compensate because you got this person that's being lazy.
My lesson was when I was 13, I got a job under the table at a pet store. But then when I was 15, I got a job as a cashier at Roy Rogers Restaurant. For people who don't know, it's a fast food restaurant. It's I think it's owned by Marriott, and it was franchised out. And there were several in the area where I grew up, and I used to ride my bike up there. And what they told me was, I met the owner. He was the one that interviewed me, the owner's son actually, and he said, you know, I'm always thinking ahead, and he said, we're going to pay, we're going to hire you, and we're going to pay you X an hour. Now, I was vaguely aware of the minimum wage. I'm not sure I even knew what the number was, but I said, well, I think I'm going to do a really good job for you. Can I get more? And what he said was, he goes, I got to be honest, the minimum wage makes it impossible for me to give you more.
That's right.
Because not only is it a minimum wage, it's a maximum wage. Because even if you're worth more, your money is being socialized and spread around to the employees to your left and right who aren't worth it, but get it because the government mandates it. One of the expressions I use is, if you're waiting around for the government to force your boss to give you a raise, you're doing it wrong. And that's what the minimum wage is. It's a maximum wage too. They can't afford to pay better employees better because they're forced to pay worse employees more.
That's right. And then there's actually an inflation rate in there too. So I think that you can probably add about 6 or 7%, some kind of an inflation rate to the 725, which is now going to take you above 8, just in that. And then you got to pay for the employers got to pay for all these other kinds of things. And so the demand for $15 an hour isn't $15 an hour.
Well, and I wrote about this. I wrote a piece, in the mid-2000s in Austin, Texas, about every year the National Education Association released their salary lists. Of 50 states, who pays teachers best, who pays teachers worst, right? And the Texas media is awful. They're just like the national media. And I used to put a picture of them all the time when I wrote about the media. It was a pack of jackals all on their hind legs, all facing in the same direction. And the caption always was a Texas press conference. And so every year Texas was in the bottom third of teacher salaries. And the media would go nuts and say, oh, my God, the Republicans running the legislature are cheap and miserly, and they're not paying teachers and all that. And I thought, well, it's pretty cheap to live here. So I wrote a piece where I looked at comparable-sized cities in the top-paying states for teachers versus Texas. And it was like 2-to-1 better to be in Austin than it was in with Stamford, Connecticut versus Austin, Texas, because that was reasonable population. No, it was Austin and San Francisco were similar populations. And then it was like Stamford, Connecticut, which was the number 1 paying teachers salary state, and Waco, Texas. And it was just so much better to be in Texas. So basically, and what I said was, so it's, in short, it's not what you get, it's what you can do with once you get it. And I juxtapose that with the minimum wage. $15 an hour in Manhattan is it's obnoxious, but it's doable. $15 an hour in Macon, Georgia is a huge job killer.
Yeah. Yep.
Because $15 here is not $15 there. And
whether you pay a state income tax in your state or you don't.
Well, and all kinds of taxes. Look, I was just in Delaware this weekend. Delaware's property tax is insanely low. They have 0 sales tax. 0. There is no sales tax. But their income tax is insane. But yes, you have that. This is one of the 9 billion reasons the founding fathers wanted federalism, because they understood that different parts of the country were different, and they required different policies and different prescriptions. And so to have this manifest unilateral imposition in all 50 states with all 11,000 taxing jurisdictions doesn't make any fiscal sense whatsoever.
Seton, I have been way back when I was in the telecommunications business, and I had to have somewhere around, I think it was about 22,000 hourly employees in several locations throughout the United States. I was dealing with minimum wage quite a bit.
Right.
And I argued back then that minimum wage should be eliminated.
Yes.
Let the entire marketplace dictate the hourly wage, if there was even going to be an hourly wage.
Right.
I mean, they could have put all these people on salary.
Well, one of the arguments you can make against it is the constitutional one. Where in the Constitution is the federal government empowered to inject itself into every employer-employee negotiation in the entire country? Because that's what they're doing with the minimum wage. They're inserting themselves and mandating something they have no power to mandate. And yes, there should be no minimum wage because there's no constitutional basis for it. There's no economic basis for it. What you find is, look, it has since calmed down a bit, but when the fracking boom took off in North Dakota, McDonald's was advertising $25 an hour for cashiers at their restaurants.
Yep.
Because there was so much business, at higher wages for people there that they couldn't get anybody in the door to do the job. So the marketplace dictates far better than government bureaucrats. And, ceilings and floors set by the government, because it works with maximums too. I mean, when Richard Nixon put price controls in, which were caps on prices, what happened? He capped the price of gasoline, and we had shortages until 1981 for 10 years, until Reagan came in and went, get rid of those, please. And we immediately, all of a sudden, the scarcity of gasoline immediately vanished. It was amazing. For a decade, we thought we were running out of gasoline, and then within 2 days, we have plenty of gasoline. I get it. Okay.
Now, the minimum wage salary, Seton, is not meant to be a living wage forever. It is an entry-level wage. And I would argue for training because, look at the turnover. Look at the turnover that you may necessarily have for these people, of which I think there's 56% have less than a high school education that are getting paid minimum wage. And this is where you tie into our stupid open borders policy.
Because we're importing. Look, the average education of the average Mexican citizen is the completion of 6th grade.
All right.
That's the average. And for Central and South America, that's high.
That's right.
It's lower beyond that. So by importing 20 million people who are junior high school dropouts, you're turning a temporary first rung on the ladder job, McDonald's, Roy Rogers, cashier at a drugstore, CVS, whatever. You're turning that first rung on the ladder up, of job experience and learning to be on time and, being diligent in your tasks and all that. You're turning that into a permanent job because you've imported 20 million people who that's all they can do.
Now, let's throw some more sand in the gears here and let's talk about unions, because I would argue that the Service Employees Union is part and parcel one of the larger backers of raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Why? Because they want to be able to bring more people into the union in order to fund the union pensions, of which are almost all are broke. True or false?
The unions are a big problem in this, and I'm sorry, my stupid dog was barking. A lot of
didn't like the minimum wage either.
Yeah. Well, a lot of I think you just said this, a lot of the union wages are tethered to and ratchet up with the minimum wage. So when they're out there dutifully, look at those great guys. They're protesting for minimum wage people who aren't even their members. That's just great. Well, yeah, they get a bump as soon as the minimum wage goes up. So, the unions are a problem too. That's why they're on the wane in the private sector. The only growth in unions is with government employees, and even FDR thought government unions were a terrible idea, and they are, because they're not unions. They're government lobbyists for government money. You can't, FDR thought unions federal unions were awful. They weren't even available until JFK, John F. Kennedy, signed an executive order creating them. And the reason is they're not petitioning for portions of profit. They're petitioning for government money. And so it's this closed little loop circle of, you've got an elected official who gets union money who then goes in and pays the union more money. It's ridiculous. It's why when Obama took over General Motors, he skipped all the general obligation debt holders, the people who were supposed to be paid first, and totally and completely made the union whole illegally out of order from the way the debt was supposed to be addressed.
The turnover rate at a minimum wage position is colossal. And
Yes.
so the cost of the churn rate, we can't, for employers, I'm not sure that that's even measurable anymore because of the way they have to go out there and advertise, and they have to go out there and go through all kinds of things to see if they even want to begin to interview this person who has filled out some kind of an application. So now we're looking at social media posts, and now we're taking polygraphs and all these other kinds of things. And there's a lot of cost to that in the human resources realm.
And then even if they get fortunate enough to hire somebody they like, they're not a useful employee right out of the gate.
No, 6 months, they say.
There's a down training period time where they're not worth the money they're being paid, regardless of what the minimum wage is. So yeah, again, the left seems to think that opening a business is a license to print money. And it's only because they have zero idea what the hell goes on in a business. They've never opened one. They've never worked. Remember Barack Obama he worked for the private sector for a grand total of like 3 months. Mm-hmm. And he referred to it as my time behind enemy lines. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So these people don't know. They think you open a business and you start, extruding gold nuggets. It's not the way it works.
Well, it wasn't too long ago that Switzerland actually put a referendum up that they were going to put their minimum wage at the entire country level, their federal level, if you will, at $25 an hour. And
right.
The employers all submitted whatever kind of reports that they did. And then there were a lot of advertising items about it. And all of a sudden, that whole referendum, that whole bill just imploded. Nobody wanted it. So they kind of essentially went back to the free market system. And we don't seem to be
learning. Did they get rid of the minimum wage in totality?
It appears to be so.
Well, no wonder they're doing better than we are.
Yeah.
It's a giant drag on hiring. It's just like Obamacare. Any restrictions you put on hiring is going to limit hiring. Obamacare says if you have more than 50 employees that are full-time, you have to give them health insurance. Yep. So you stop hiring at 49 and you hire them for 29 hours a week or less.
Or we're going to replace you with a robot and we're going to go to touch
I
screens.
think that is a little overblown. I think that's not going to happen as quickly as people think.
But it is happening.
It is happening. And it's happening in the places where they're pushing hardest for the money because for example, I went to a restaurant a couple weeks ago, a month ago, or whatever it was, and they had an iPad or a tablet on the table.
Yes, me
too. They
had
had a waitress, but that's going to go away.
Yeah.
They had the waitress to bring the food, but I ran restaurants. I'm telling you, the waiters and waitresses are going away. You're going to punch in your order on the tablet, and then you're going to have food runners, not waiters and waitresses, just food runners.
That's right. You
that
want
run
more
the
water?
Food from the kitchen to the table.
Yeah, you want more water or more iced tea? Push this button.
Right. And you'll have a little soda gun or whatever on the table. I don't know. I don't know how they're going to address adult beverage because you have to have human control over the adult beverage because of the laws. But there's tablets and McDonald's. You can go look. All they have to do is spin that little touch screen around, right?
That's right.
And you punch it, and then your order of your food comes up, and bye-bye all the cashiers.
And now you got apps,
Oh, listen, you can look my McDonald's app. I can order on my app and go pick it up. And Wawa too. We got a Wawa near me.
Yeah, Wawa.
I can order my food and walk in and get it and go. So again, the technology is coming, but we're not helping anybody by importing 20 million people to compete for jobs. I love the open borders morons who also are pro hiking the minimum wage. Well, you're importing people to drive down wages, and then you want the government to mandate a higher wage. You're a genius.
Well, we have these intermittent protests where we go to, grocery stores or department stores, or even in the construction, or even in, public schools, cashiers, retail, cooks, waiters, janitors, cleaners, those kinds of things. And I guarantee you, if they really look at it, if we really ask these people, they're not getting paid minimum wage. They may be getting paid $10 an hour, but they're demanding 15. So they're not even at the minimum wage level either, are they?
No. They're getting no. And that's the thing. The waiters and bartenders, I think, get half of minimum wage, if I recall properly.
Exactly.
And even then, and I'll tell you what, it's less than half now, because the last time or two that the feds raised the minimum wage, they didn't raise the tip position wage.
Correct.
So it's less than half. It started out as half, and then the last couple of ratchets didn't apply to bartenders and waiters because they work for tips, or whoever works for tips.
And that was part of the waivers that those types of people in food service or drink service were getting on Obamacare.
Right.
Because you can't rely on a predicted tip income.
Right.
If you're in that business.
Because it varies wildly from day to day and shift
and
to
your
shift.
schedule, yes, and your schedule. Yeah, exactly right.
And again, we get back to meritocracy. If you're a better waiter or bartender, you get better shifts than the lesser waiters. And if you're a terrible waiter, you get Monday lunch. If you're a great waiter or a great bartender, you get Friday nights and Saturday nights.
So
where there's a lot more customers and a lot more money and all of that. So
let's say
once again, our ongoing efforts to try to get away from being a meritocracy.
So we propose some legislation that the federal government does away with minimum wage altogether and lets the free market. I'm all for that. Okay. What would be the fallout? Would we have half the country taking a knee on that one?
This is the problem Mitt Romney ran into in 2012. They made the conscious decision to run him as, I'm a businessman and I'm your boss, I'm the boss, and you should support me. The problem is, for every one employer in the United States, there's 50 employees who hate their boss. Mm-hmm. And he was not a very likable guy. Trump is irascible. Trump is, certainly grating in a lot of ways. But they tried to Mitt Romney Trump, and it didn't stick. It wouldn't stick.
Yeah.
They made Romney the evil monopoly man from JP Moneybags, and they tried to do it again with Trump because of course he's even more wealthy than Romney is, but it didn't. It was a square peg in a round hole. It didn't fit, and it didn't work, and so it takes a guy like Trump to sell something like that. I'm afraid there are too many people who would view that, because again, we've had 75 years of government schools now where people don't understand economics but they understand grudges. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure we can get there. I think the best we can hope for is to, every time they try to go to 15, you're like, well, that's too ridiculous, because they're too far. They're trying to double it basically. And I think if they went from, whatever it is, 750 to 9 or 8, I think they'd get there and we couldn't stop them. But the fact that they're going for 15 when it's, less than half that, that's the only thing preventing them from gaining ground, is the fact that they're asking for too much.
Well, I think that just for fun, I think the whole concept should be floated out there. Just put it out there as a trial balloon. Because under federalism, it seems to be necessarily being handled at the state and local level anyway, and that you get the government out of that business. And I would imagine you would have an awful lot of employers that would step up and endorse that kind of action. I think. I don't
think so. The employers don't want to take on that headache. I don't think so.
Okay.
I know. Look at the damn NFL. Look at the owners there.
Well,
standing by their employees, even when they're completely and totally wrong.
That's collective bargaining. They're all union employees.
It doesn't matter. You do not want to be the boss that comes out and says, I think my employees should make, I want the opportunity or the ability to pay my employees less. That is not a winning position to take. And the left knows this. That's why they keep pressing on these things.
Yeah, true. There's some of that going on too. Ladies and gentlemen, please go visit lessgovernment.org and pay attention to some of these items that Seton Motley puts out from time to time. I can tell when he gets a burr in his saddle and fires off a couple of things there because the emails come in and I go, okay, let's call Seton. Let's see what he has to say about this. But I think the minimum wage thing isn't going to go away, and as a consequence, I think that there are some things that the federal government necessarily needs to do. And I think they ought to do a trial balloon and do away with it altogether. But thank you, Seton, for being with us here.
Yeah, and don't forget the next step in all this. The next step in all this is the universal living wage.
Yeah, the living wage. Yeah.
Exactly.
There you go.
Thank you very much, miss.
Okay, there's more coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you these two 24/7 streams of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. Talk America Radio is a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. Please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. You can contribute monthly or send us a one-time amount. We'll put it to good use continuing to share the American voice. Thank you.
Hi, this is Michelle Malkin from CRTV.com, and you're listening to Talk America Radio, the new dominant force in conservative talk radio.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, it's Mark Walters from Armed American Radio. You know, for nearly a decade, I've been educating, informing, and entertaining responsibly armed Americans. And during that time together, we've shared some ups and downs, haven't we? Trump's election saved our Supreme Court and no doubt the future of our gun rights for now. But now is not the time to lay down. The enemies of freedom are well-funded and more determined than ever. To keep up with the state of your gun rights, make sure to tune in to Armed American Radio right here on Talk America Radio, the new dominant voice in conservative talk radio.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia. And WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Changing gears from minimum wage, and we're going to trot on over to Beijing, and I would say over to Pyongyang and all things North Korea. So we have Gordon Chang with us, a previous guest who's the expert du jour. I mean, it seems like every time somebody wants to talk about North Korea, including me, we go to Gordon Chang. So, Gordon, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Oh, thank you so much, Denise. I really appreciate this.
My pleasure for sure. Except that I wish we were talking about something else, because I mean, this has gotten to a point where nobody's going to back down. We've got military strike threats going on in social media between government leaders here, and I would call that reckless. What say you?
Well, the North Koreans are reckless, and we've heard this from Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho starting on Saturday in his General Assembly speech. Then he talked about how President Trump's tweets, were an act of war. And basically what he said was that war was now inevitable. Now, the North Koreans have talked about war many times. They've threatened to incinerate the United States on numerous occasions, but they always prefaced their comments on an attack by the United States on North Korea, and then North Korea said, yes, we're going to attack you back. What was significant about Ri Yong-ho's speech on Saturday was that he talked about war being inevitable, and he did not preface it by saying that the North Koreans were retaliating. What they were saying was that President Trump's language by itself was a casus belli. This is very new. And we also saw something like this from Ri Yong-ho today in his impromptu press conference in New York, just before he left the United States. You know, he was talking again about how President Trump's words were a declaration of war, how the North Koreans had the right to shoot American warplanes out of the sky, even if they were in international airspace.
Yes,
this is getting dangerous.
It is getting dangerous, and we're seeing words, Gordon, like highest level of hardline countermeasures in history.
Yeah,
I mean,
we know what that means. This means a nuclear exchange, and clearly the North Koreans have ramped up the rhetoric to the point where they're actually becoming a clear and present danger and even an imminent threat by their words alone. Now, I don't believe that they mean this, but nonetheless, they need to start to understand how Americans are going to listen to their threats.
Well, look, we're obviously concerned for Japan, and we're obviously concerned for Guam, because, I mean, the last missile went beyond those destinations by a great factor. But now you have a U.S. country, if you are a state, if you will, Hawaii, that is close to panic. I mean, they are preparing for the worst here. So that tells you that we are taking these things seriously, and especially a very vulnerable set of islands in the Pacific. And yet Beijing is telling the United States, calm down and go sit in a corner. We have this. And they don't, do they?
No, I mean, clearly the Chinese are on North Korea's side. Even though there's a lot of friction right now between Beijing and Pyongyang, it's clear that Chinese leaders are supporting the North Koreans. And indeed, in the last several years, they've weaponized North Korea.
Yes.
So the United States needs to understand where the Chinese stand. We try and always talk about trying to get cooperation from Beijing. But the only way to get China's cooperation is to give it no choice but to be cooperative. In other words, to impose costs that are so severe that they cannot resist us. And this is going to be difficult for Americans. We don't want to do this, but we do need to coerce the Chinese, because after decades of trying to buy their cooperation with initial concessions from us, it just hasn't worked.
Gordon, over in the late last week, it was announced that Beijing would stop financial or banking relationships with North Korea. And that was supposed to be some colossal revelation that now that Xi Jinping is going to cooperate and everything's going to be hunky-dory. And I'm calling foul on that one. In a big way. There had to have been some side meetings with some of the Chinese leaders where even those statements would have been made, but I'm not trusting them, because I would argue that Beijing all along has aided and abetted North Korea on how to skirt sanctions in the first place. True or false?
Oh, of course. And it's been large and small Chinese banks that have been laundering money for the North Koreans. What the Chinese did last week was, it's unclear. President Trump on Thursday said, and he thanked Xi Jinping of China for ordering the Chinese central bank to order Chinese commercial banks not to do business with North Korea. But on Friday, the foreign ministry spokesman Liu Kong denied that that was the case. He said that he denied that the People's Bank of China, which is the central bank, had ordered Chinese commercial banks not to open up new accounts with North Korean individuals and businesses. So we don't really know what the state of play is with regard to China. We know that President Trump has thanked his Chinese counterpart, but I'm not so sure that the Chinese are as cooperative as President Trump thinks they have been. Because, we have seen decades of North Koreans launder their money through Chinese banks. And that is a violation of U.S. law because the North Koreans have been engaging in dollar transactions. Every dollar transaction clears in New York. And so this has been an abuse of the U.S. financial system.
Puts a whole different definition on currency manipulation, doesn't it?
It certainly does. The only way that the Chinese are going to stop this is when President Trump declares a large Chinese bank a primary money laundering concern under Section 311 of the Patriot Act. That means that such an institution would no longer have the ability to conduct business in dollars. And because the dollar is the world's predominant currency, more than half the world's transactions are conducted in dollars, it's essentially a death sentence on China's big banks. We need to do this because, first of all, we have to enforce our own law. But second of all, we have to show the Chinese that we are willing to take bold steps to protect not only the U.S. financial system, but the American people.
Gordon, we hear this, that there is a prediction that there's going to be some kind of a hydrogen weapon. And we're all just kind of sitting around waiting for the arms control experts to tell us where it is, when it is, and those kinds of things. We may not get that warning. But in the meantime, I would argue that not enough is paid to other kinds of threats, historical events that North Korea has pulled on the West, and I would say some colossal cyber attack. Are we having enough of that discussion, Gordon, in your opinion?
Well, we had the answer is no, we're not having enough of that discussion, and we're not defending our networks, and this is a bipartisan problem. We've already had one colossal North Korean cyber attack on the United States, and that was on Sony Pictures Entertainment in 2014. And that attack was launched from Chinese IP addresses.
Yes.
So it had China's complicity, maybe even active participation. I mean, we don't know. But unfortunately, the Obama administration was not willing to call out China on this, just as the Bush administration before it was unwilling to confront Beijing on Chinese cyber attacks against the U.S. And so at this point, we need a bipartisan consensus because we've had liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats completely fail us on this issue.
In a big way. We can't seem to come to, I've listened to congressional hearings more than once on this very topic. It's not like these members of the House and the Senate are not aware of this. It's just that nobody seems to pick up this baton and want to run with it and put something on paper to advance it at least into committee, much less debate it and have it come out of committee, which I think is derelict in duty because the devastation on a cyber attack can be have a very lasting sense of destruction here.
Well, it could take down the entire United States. Just imagine what living without electricity would be. So, the American people should be really angry at their leaders, and not just the current ones, but ones going back for several administrations, because they know the danger. They know that we can do something about it, and they absolutely failed to. And so this, to me, is inexplicable and certainly inexcusable.
Gordon, there's been very little talk about the role that Iran plays with North Korea, and I see a little bit of it, but not nearly enough. In the fact that we have got some experts in North Korea that spend an awful lot of time in Tehran and vice versa. Are we too afraid to bring those two together in the same discussion? And I would argue that that too is certainly being fueled by Moscow. Am I overcomplicating it, in your opinion, or are we just got this gorilla in the room that everybody's walking around?
Yeah, we've been walking around this for quite some time, and especially the previous administration, because it wanted to arrive at a comprehensive nuclear weapons agreement with the Iranians, which turned out to be the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. They did not want to talk about Iran's cooperation with North Korea. But Iran is estimated to pay North Korea somewhere between $2 to $3 billion a year for their various forms of cooperation. We know that the Iranians buy North Korean missiles. We know that the Iranians are obtaining North Korean nuclear weapons technology. I suspect that the Iranians are paying for the chemical weapons that are used in Syria. Those are, some of them, or even most of them, are from North Korea, and I don't think the Assad regime actually has the money for that. So when we look at this comprehensive partnership between Iran and North Korea, compasses nukes, compasses missiles, we need to go after it and break it, and we have not been willing to do that.
And I also would say it includes drones, too. I think there was one that was traced in and around the confines of North Korea that turned out to be an Iranian drone, or certainly the technology is being passed off to Pyongyang.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, because these two countries have worked very closely together, and it's not just recently, it's been over the course of decades.
We have got a lot of rogue countries out there that we rarely also discuss that hire an awful lot of North Korean labor, and I would call them slaves. Qatar being one of them, places in Africa being the other. And I would call that a human rights violation, and yet nobody seems to be tackling that whole part either. I mean, Russia used North Korean slaves when they were building the infrastructure for the Sochi Olympics. Qatar is using that same kind of slave labor for the World Cup. Why is that whole component being ignored too, in your opinion?
Well, it's been ignored because the United States hasn't pushed it. And now the Trump administration is actually trying to stop all use of North Korean labor by the countries you mentioned. And, of course, there's some other ones. So this is, an attempt on the part of the administration to cut off the flow of money into North Korea. Because if we can cut off the flow of money, Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, can't build nukes or missiles, and he can't engage in gift politics, which is really his buying off of senior regime elements by giving them luxury cars and other gifts. So we need to stop this flow of money into the DPRK, as North Korea calls itself.
Gordon, in the case of communications going into North Korea, a lot of that infrastructure is resident inside the borders of China, making it, I think, even more difficult for us to be able to monitor or maybe even interfere with. And I would say that if we cut off telecom communications into North Korea, or certainly impede some of that, it may be kind of like a cheap man's version of a Stuxnet operation on North Korea. Is that a viable short-term solution?
Well, short term. The New York Times has reported that is a possibility that one of the reasons why North Korean missiles were failing, as they were about 6 months ago, was because the United States was basically planting all sorts of worms into North Korea's programs. I hope that's the case, but nobody outside of a tight circle of people actually knows what the United States has been doing. But it would be something that you'd expect, and this was done during the Obama administration. This is something that you'd expect the U.S. to be trying to do to try to slow down the North Koreans. Now, this is only a short-term solution. As we've seen, North Korea has had a number of successful missile tests recently. So whatever we've done or what we haven't done doesn't seem to be slowing down the North Koreans now.
We know precisely where some of these locations are, and if not all of these locations of where he has his missile facilities, and I would even argue his nuclear facilities. We're using the seismic experts, meaning those that measure earthquakes. We are looking at the originations of where these missiles take off. So are you confident? Because I have some confidence, and I can be unsold if I have to be, and certainly for the sake of the listeners, that we know more than what we're actually being told of what is happening in North Korea?
Well, I'm sure the U.S. intelligence community knows a little bit more than what we know. I'm not confident they know a hell of a lot more. I mean, we know some of their nuclear weapon sites. We know where their missile sites are. But there's a lot that the North Koreans have been able to bury underground where we probably don't know. And so I wish that we had greater confidence. But at this point, I'm sure that the North Koreans have facilities that we at this point don't know about.
We keep hearing that China is very, very worried that a whole set of millions of North Koreans, if things certainly escalate, that China's worst worry is having all these North Koreans escape over the border into China, and that would be devastating for China. I'm not convinced that would happen. Am I wrong there?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The Chinese, I think, of course, are concerned about refugees, but they're not that concerned because the border between North Korea and China is formed by three natural features: the Yalu River, the Tumen River, and Mount Pektu, which is an active volcano. And so the People's Armed Police and the People's Liberation Army, they can defend those borders. I think that in the case of a failure of the North Korean state, North Koreans would want to move south into the other Korea. I mean, why move into a place where they don't want you, which is China, to a place where they welcome you? And during when times were less tense, we actually demined a number of corridors through the demilitarized zone, which separates the two Koreas. So there are roads and there's railway, and this is where the North Koreans would just simply walk along the railroad tracks into South Korea.
I'm glad you said that, because I those questions are asked of me often, and I try and explain it, and I'm not sure that I'm getting through, and you know more about this than I do, certainly with your dedication to it. Now, we also hear that millions will die in Seoul if things escalate, because we have all of these artillery batteries on the 38th parallel. I'm pretty convinced that the Pentagon has been over this for the last 30 or 40 years, such that they know what is sitting there, that they could necessarily defend Seoul. And what do we have? 25,000 U.S. troops there that we have been co-training with for 30 years. Is Seoul that much of a risk? I mean, where we're going to hear millions will die there too?
Well, Seoul is a metropolitan area of 26 million people. The casualties would be horrific, or could be. I mean, this gets a little bit complicated and into the weeds, but there are about 14,300 artillery tubes the North Koreans have, which is just north of the demilitarized zone. We know that they got high explosives, but also chemical and biological agents, and of course nuclear weapons. And it really depends on how much they want to punish Seoul. I suspect that in a general conflict, you would have deaths in the millions in fairly short order, maybe in the first couple days. But we don't know what North Korean doctrine is. And so, for instance, if there were surgical strikes on North Korea, maybe the regime would not retaliate by starting a general conflict. They might. We just, at this point, don't have any insight into that. And that's what deters us. So because of the possibility of horrific casualties in the South Korean capital, we don't really consider the use of military options. But, Denise, we've got a lot of non-military options that we can employ, and many of them, I think, would be extremely effective. So the discussion about the Seoul really, I think, is something well into the future that we don't have to consider just quite yet, because we do have these non-kinetic means of disarming North Korea.
Meaning banking and meaning communications, even our own form of an EMP?
Well, just think about President Trump's sanctions in his executive order that he announced last Thursday. That's a very important step forward. It's, I think, overdue, but nonetheless, if the Treasury Department enforces these, North Korea is just not going to have the money to realize its ambitions. So I think that we should hope that the president vigorously enforces these sanctions, because if he does that, then I think that we're going to see both China and Russia move in much better directions. I think we're going to see the North Koreans really concerned about an American president for the first time in decades. So this is a very, very important step forward, and I hope the president talks more about this than he has in the last couple of days.
We know where North Korea does their banking outside of North Korea. So I would argue that we have the ability to put pressure on those banks to seize those accounts. Not that we would take the money, but we're freezing it. They cannot have access to it. I think that is long overdue, but I'm not quite sure that anybody's pulled that trigger on that yet. Are you?
Yeah, well, President Trump, to his great credit, on June 29th, did designate Bank of Dandong, which is a small Chinese bank, a primary money laundering concern under the Patriot Act. That was a good step, but really was only a signal to Beijing that the president was willing to go after bigger Chinese institutions. So far, he hasn't gone after Bank of China, which is one of China's so-called Big Four banks. It's actually the fourth largest bank in the world as ranked by assets. They've been named in a 2016 UN report for devising and operating a money laundering scheme for the North Koreans. They're just involved in dirty business, and so were some of other China's large banks. President Trump needs to go after them to show the Chinese that he is determined. On Thursday, essentially the administration, and I can understand why they did this, they gave a free pass to all conduct before Thursday. Is basically hoping that the Chinese and others would actually start enforcing money laundering laws. We'll see if they do.
Yeah, that's what I kind of meant by maybe there were some side conversations going on there that presenting Beijing with some evidence that we know this and we know that. So if you don't want this exposed, we need you to sign on over here. And I have a feeling that maybe some of those discussions happen. I know you're a busy man, so I'm going to ask you one last question, and that is about the naval blockade. It appears, Gordon, that we have been given some kind of approval, our Navy has been given some kind of approval to begin to track any of these rogue North Korean, Iranian flagged craft, such that we might even have to board them and search them. I think that's a pretty good idea, but that could actually raise the temperature here. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, it would raise the temperature, but we need to do it because we need to stop North Korea from selling missiles to Iran, chemical weapons to the Syrians, and all the rest of it. So Security Council Resolution 2375, which was adopted this month, doesn't go far enough in giving member states, including the U.S., the right to board North Korean ships. But also, Denise, remember the North Koreans abrogated the Korean War armistice, which means we have the right to sink those ships. And if we have the right to sink them, we certainly have the right to board them to search for weapons. And we got to remember also that Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho just today talked about how President Trump declared war on them. Well, we should take him at his words. Okay, Absolutely. If we're at war, we're going to board your ships, North Korea. We need to tell them that.
Well done, Gordon Chang. Thanks so much for your insight and your expert presentation here and for being on the Denise Simon Experience. Come back again soon.
Thank you so much, Denise.
All right, thank you. Well, we're coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
suppress, Mike Charlie 4 tree 5 9er 2-1, grid to mark, Mike Charlie 4-7 tree 9er 8-9er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I've got an old friend. I don't think I've talked to him in a couple of years, but from time to time, I do reach out to people in my past. And I've got Monty Granger with us. And Monty, you know, he's a great guy because he's written the book Saving Grace in Guantanamo. And we've talked about that several times, trying to certainly encourage everybody to read his book. And I brought him on because 2 reasons. One, we want to talk about Guantanamo here a little bit. And 2, the other topic would be the Peshmerga vote. But Monty, thank you for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. And I do want to talk about Guantanamo because it appears, and you have to tell me, you're a lot closer to this than I am, but it appears that we're going to begin to escalate some things in Afghanistan, and rightly so, finally, after 8 years. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling, because of some clues that President Trump has dropped, that Guantanamo may become part of the discussions again, and that's going to set a lot of hair on fire out there in the world. But I think it's the right thing to do because we haven't been catching any enemies on the battlefield. We seem to have been using little joysticks and just killing them with a missile. And we're missing out on a lot of intelligence. So do you see that, you know, some additional lights may come on in the future for Guantanamo?
Well, I hope so, but let me start by saying thank you so much, Denise, for having me on the show. I appreciate you reaching out to me, and I'm so honored and blessed to be able to come on with you. Yeah, I hope the lights get turned back on. I did a blog several months ago about how Trump has to get Gitmo right. And since he took office and before he took office, there have been some comments about Guantanamo Bay that I have felt were encouraging. It's taken some time, and I think part of that process has to do with some of the personnel changes that he's made. Mm-hmm. You know, the firing of Reince Priebus, replacing with John Kelly. Now, John Kelly, retired Marine Corps general, once oversaw the operations at Gitmo. Mm-hmm. So now he's got another person with some knowledge and background that can add to the mix. And unfortunately, I think there's not a whole lot of that in there. I'm pretty sure they don't have anyone with specific Army military incarceration experience. Nothing against General Kelly, but neither Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, or the Coast Guard trained for detention operations. Only the Army has detention operation units. And why isn't the Army included in this? Well, probably because they're not being treated equally, or amongst that tight group of high-level officers don't have the president's ear enough. Even though there are high-ranking Army officers, those high-ranking Army officers also don't have the incarceration mission background. So I hope the lights do go on, but they have to go on the right way. And what I mean by that is currently, you know, Guantanamo Bay has released 730 detainees. None of them have been executed, beheaded, blown up, hacked to death, dragged naked and lifeless through the streets, drowned, or, you know, set on fire. All things our enemies have done to us and or our allies. There is no moral comparison, Denise, between what we do at Gitmo and what our enemies do with captives. So we actually have the finest military detention facility on earth at Guantanamo Bay. And sometimes I think it's too good. In other words, you know, if you're a captured unlawful combatant Islamist who wants to kill us, you get a free Quran, you get free prayer beads and a prayer rug, you get halal meals, special Muslim holiday meals, including baklava and lamb. You get white robes if you're good. You get to wear a long beard. You get the free services of a U.S. military Muslim chaplain. You get a multi-$100,000 soccer field. Now, some of this is not too bad because, prison psychology says keep them fat and happy and they're less dangerous and more compliant. But the guys we have now, how much more information can we get from them? What is really going on amongst those 730 who we released? What are they telling their brothers about this operation there? Is it like Islamist R&R? Because you're going to get released unless they somehow accuse you of a war crime. So I don't really believe that they should be getting everything that they're getting. Why? Because they didn't earn it. During World War II, we held over 400,000 lawful combatant prisoner of wars, most from Germany, in the United States without one call for extra legal privileges for them. But they earned the rights and privileges that they did have as prisoners of war by following the Geneva Conventions. None of these detainees earned anything. In fact, they're unlawful combatants that could have been rightfully shot dead on the battlefield. So why are we extending them the same courtesies, privileges that we do a legal prisoner of war? Well, part of it is the 2009 Military Commissions Act, which gave them virtually the same rights as you or I would enjoy in a federal court of law if they're accused of a war crime. And the liberal left, mainstream media, and human rights groups out there always like to bring up the fact that, oh, none of these guys were charged and they didn't get a trial. Well, they're not entitled. In fact, remember those 400,000 German POWs? Well, by Geneva, they're not entitled to a trial, or they don't have to be charged. They're just held until the end of hostilities. So that piece is missing. And how much of that is getting through to Trump and his decision makers on this, I don't know. The only thing we do know is that Trump has drafted several, and this is from the New York Times, he's drafted several possible replacement executive orders regarding Guantanamo Bay. And they are in preparation of receiving additional terrorists or unlawful combatants. So there are plans that we know that are in the works to receive them. I guess the legal team is just looking for that pathway. But in my mind, and the way it's been and is today, it's through the AUMF for the authorization for use of military force, which each year is renewed. So that gives us the authorization to go out and shoot people, capture people, and retain people so that we can get important information that could possibly save lives.
Monty, I generally get an email from time to time from the Department of Defense where they're bringing a hearing to order in the courtroom in Guantanamo to determine whether we're going to let any of this, the next guy go. And interestingly enough, in the last couple of months, I haven't gotten any. So it appears that, things have slowed down there substantially. And we also know that it has been said who is left there in Guantanamo. I think we're at 61 prisoners now, or detainees.
It's actually 41.
41. They're the worst of the worst, right?
At least one is convicted and serving a sentence. And about 10 are currently being tried. They're still in the preliminary, but hopefully the trial will start next year, maybe June of 2018. And the reason for this is all the procedural hoops you have to go through because the last, the former rules that Obama put through in 2009, Military Commissions Act, gave them the same rights you or I would enjoy in a federal court of law. Yeah. If, for example, the rules were just the same as they were for 8 German saboteurs in 1942 who were caught dry foot on U.S. soil, what President Roosevelt did was convene a military tribunal, a military court, with the blessing of a unanimous Supreme Court, also denied them habeas corpus rights. They were tried according to the Geneva Conventions and the law of land warfare. The law of land warfare is Army Field Manual 27-10, and that is just turning the Geneva Conventions into military speak. So what that does is give an accused war criminal the same rights as a U.S. soldier would get were they on trial in a UCMJ violation. So uniform code of military justice is what a U.S. soldier would be tried through. So that seems fair. And that's what the world has agreed on in international law, which, of course, the left liberals never talk about, what international law says we should do with Gitmo detainees. They just want to say, well, they've never been tried, they don't have any rights. Well, they do have rights, but not a lot. But when we tried those 8 German saboteurs, 2 flipped on the other 6, and in less than 2 months, those 6 were executed. They're found guilty of spying. They had the means and intent to kill and destroy property. And actually, the most interesting thing to me about this, Denise, is they didn't hurt anybody.
True enough.
These German saboteurs didn't blow anything up. They just had the means and intent. And that's all that's required in the Geneva Conventions and law of land warfare. So if we apply those same standards to the gentleman in Gitmo now standing trial, they probably would have been found guilty and executed 15 years ago or whenever they came in. It would have been pretty quick because of the rules that apply. And why we aren't using them? Well, President Bush created the Military Commissions Act of 2006. And if you read Donald Rumsfeld's known and unknown, his autobiography, there are several sections in there about Gitmo and the decision-making about what went on in the discussions for the 2006 MCA. And they wanted to appear to the world, because they knew time was not on their side, that they were being fair. Well, what they did was they changed the law. They made it too fair. In other words, they started giving the detainees rights that they did not earn.
Yeah.
And that's why we're in the situation we're in now.
Well, it'll be a very interesting, we have sent some additional troops to Afghanistan. There's more apparently that have been approved. We don't know about their deployments yet. And it isn't necessarily just about Afghanistan either, because we've got Syria and Iraq. And then I would also argue even Somalia and, Sudan. So I think in the case of Guantanamo, that where Europe is with their threats and their intermittent terror attacks, they would be very happy that we would be able to capture some of these, detain them, and help them with even more intelligence, them being Europe. Although I'm not sure how much more they necessarily need, because we always seem to find out that these, lone wolves, which are never lone wolves, were always already known to intelligence officials.
Yeah, Afghanistan, if you look at the big picture, we're not in a great position now, because President Obama withdrew all U.S. forces from Iraq in 2011, declared the war on terror over. In 2013, and tried to destroy the military from within, both with firing generals and with underfunding initiatives and through basic neglect. And actually, I believe the man despises the Marines, hates the military, despises the Marines. So picking up where Trump comes in, you have the hiring of retired military generals, which you hope will play nice in the sandbox together, come up with a plan that makes sense. The plan that really should have made sense was staying in Afghanistan and in Iraq after we had won the peace in those places for the most part, and coming up with the Middle East Marshall Plan. If you look at Germany, Japan, and Italy, for example, our enemies in World War II over 73 years ago. They were our mortal enemies. And now they're three of the most prosperous and peaceful countries on earth.
Amazing.
Not in spite of us, right, but because of us. We're still there.
Exactly.
And I think people lose that in the discussion of it. We're kind of reinventing the wheel. And we don't need to. We have a model that works and is still working. And do we have, the political courage to do what we know works? And the problem has been the past 8 years that the political goals and the military goals have been different.
Indeed.
Almost day and night different.
Indeed.
And when that happens, take Vietnam, we lose. When the political goals and the military goals are the same, World War II, we succeed. So now I perceive somewhat of a struggle. There's something going on that's just not right.
I agree with you.
And I'm concerned about it because you'd think with the people that Trump has put in place, things would be a little smoother. Part of the problem may not have anything to do with Trump and everything to do with rhinos and never Trumpers.
There's some leftovers at the Pentagon that are going to need,
right.
Some new memos.
So somebody in there is taking their foot off the accelerator. Maybe it's caution, maybe it's good caution. I know it's hard for us sometimes to understand everything that goes into making a good decision, and Trump seems to be one who's more inclined to make it quickly. Sort of like what Patton said, a good decision today is better than the perfect plan next week. So, Patton was all about taking the initiative and going with the best plan available and killing the enemy. Whereas in this case, it seems to be so politicized and so ingrained in a multipolar world, which we have. We've always had multipolar world, even when it was us in the Soviet Union. There are always other influences. You and I will never know what all those influences are. We'll never know everything that goes into a decision the president or his staff make. What we hope is that their decision will be one that's good for us long term. And that's what I'm hoping.
Monty, this kind of brings us over to the Peshmerga, the Kurds in Iraq, because they have been friends to the West for a very, very long time. This is a group of people that has been at war for a very, very long time. They don't ask for much. There is about as dedicated a group of people, very westernized, very loyal, very patient, very dedicated, and yet I'm seeing, Monty, that they're not getting the support out of the Tillerson State Department that I really kind of expected they to get. But they voted for the referendum for independence. And yet there's all these other forces out there, Turkey and whatnot, and even our own State Department that are like pushing back on this whole thing. Why can't we settle this thing with the Peshmerga?
Right. So here we go again with the political and military goals being separate. You and I can look at this as rational human beings with some knowledge of military operations can say, well, all we have to do is support them and they'll be fine. But you've got a lot of players. You mentioned two of them, Turkey and Iran. You probably have the Chinese involved, the Russians involved through Syria. You have the U.S. involved. You have Iraq involved. And then within Iraq, you have factions. So, after World War I, when Britain and France pretty much carved up the Ottoman Empire, and today you have about 30 million ethnic Kurds scattered over this area, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, they left a mess. And Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria were able to suppress and oppress the Kurds. And what you have today is some self-determination because ISIS came into Iraq and Syria and established themselves. So it was convenient. The Kurds became an ally of convenience. So what kind of moral loyalty do we owe to the Kurds And Donald Trump is probably asking the question, well, what deal did we make with them? Was there anything signed? Was it all a wink and a handshake, or I got your back, you got mine, and when the dust settles, we go our separate ways? We don't know any of that information. So at this point, when we see them, we're assuming that it was a positive vote, but it's non-binding.
Correct. I was just going to say that.
What they're trying to do is give Masoud Barzani, their leader, a mandate to negotiate a secession. But it's an oil-producing region.
Yeah.
So you got 800,000 barrels or something like that a day.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of stands out. And so with that at stake, you see that the politics of it is going to overcome any myth of military import. So the fact that you have the Kurds there, and they're very good fighters, very loyal. Yes, they've said recently in the weeks leading up to this that they will die for their idea of an independent country.
And they
That's
do.
Great. They may have to keep doing that, because Turkey is not just going to roll over.
No.
And Iran,
neither is Iran.
Iran has big eyes on this target. And they may have even infiltrated the Kurds. They made friends with the Kurds. I think it was 1988 when Saddam Hussein gassed them.
Yes.
Well, guess what the Kurds did? They went across the border, and the Iranians were so nice to them. So there's some relationships there people may have forgotten exist. And it may be, unfortunately, to the Kurds' disadvantage now because of that friendship and those ties that were made. It may make them a little weaker toward their frenemy to the east.
Exactly.
So you picked probably one of the most complex issues out there today. And what's going to happen to the Kurds? Well, no one knows what's going to happen, but today may be, an historic push one way or the other. It may, anger the Turks, Iranians,
Russians.
Iraqis.
Mm.
They may not like this assertion by Barzani at all, and this whole thing may come crashing down on his head. But that would have to be extremely bloody and long, which nobody really has an interest in doing. But they do have an interest in 800 million barrels of oil a day.
Which also tells me that, the whole thing of dividing up Iraq, is back in the, the discussion. But you know what? These Peshmerga, they've earned their wings. Let them have their oil. Let them have their independence. Leave them alone and just deal with everything else, because everything it doesn't have to be in the discussion, but it is. And as you say, it's the most complicated thing that there is. We are finally kind of giving them. Trump is giving them actually some military support that the Obama administration refused to give them all along. So maybe that will help. But because with that. Military assets that we're providing for them also come some caveats that this is what you need to do and this is how you need to behave. So it'll be very, very interesting what Baghdad does and all of the rest going into the end of this vote today. But ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Monty Granger, and find him over there on Twitter, because he's staying on top of things. He's very, very dedicated, and someday, Monty, I hope you and I can certainly cross paths beyond a handshake. I'd like to just give you a big hug. You got the stick-to-itiveness and the dedication and the loyalty that is often so fleeting, and I just want you to know that I, for nothing else, recognize that.
You're very kind to me. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your support.
Yeah, come back
that
again
of your
soon.
Listeners.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
All right. Thank you. Well, we're coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. So stay with us.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia.
And Don Newen from Cowboy Logic Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't go to sleep every night completely fatigued from trying to restore America from the destruction that is taking place,
Then you're simply not doing enough. Join us every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, for Cowboy Logic Radio.
let the restoration begin.
Hi, this is Denise Simon, the host of the Denise Simon Experience. I feel compelled to tell you people that Don Newen is my favorite talk radio host, period. Not Mark Levin, not Rush Limbaugh. I can't do this.
Do it, Denise. Read it. Read it, Denise.
Not Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham, but yep, Don Newen. Cowboy Logic Radio is featuring the ever-stellar, highly gifted Don Newen, right here on Talk America Radio.
This is Don Newen with Cowboy Logic Radio. On behalf of my beautiful co-host, Donna Fiducia, I'd like to express my gratitude to Denise Simon for those kind words. I don't think I could have done it better if I would have written that myself. Cowboy Logic Radio, every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on Talk America Radio. This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
And thanks for staying with us here, ladies and gentlemen, on the Denise Simon Experience. I've got a distant friend that we kind of know a lot of common friends, and I kind of follow him and he kind of follows me, but I'm not sure that we've had him on the show before. But please welcome with me Fred Gedrich. Now, Fred has served both in the State Department and the Department of Defense in foreign policy and national security. He's also a very big contributor to a lot of the media outlets that we know out there, such as the American Spectator, the Washington Times, Breitbart, and Front Page. And our topic is Fred and his family just came back from a trip in Eastern Europe. And I was kind of watching some of his photojournalism, if you will. And so I just tapped him on the shoulder and said, we want to talk about this trip. So Fred, thanks so much for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Denise, I'm delighted to be with you today.
I had such a good time watching you travel abroad with your family, but you know, your destinations were destinations that I think a lot of the listeners would also like to at some point take and visit, just as you did. We don't always get these opportunities, but maybe you can kind of sell these trips to us. And I think we'll kind of start off with the Brandenburg Gate. And the Brandenburg has got kind of a long, very peculiar history that I don't think people have paid much attention to. I mean, it has the fingerprints of Napoleon on it, and certainly, you know, Hitler's rise to power, and John F. Kennedy and Reagan. And so tell us about your experience at the Brandenburg Gate.
Well, my first experience when I saw it, it was at night, and it's for all your listeners who have had the same opportunities I did at night. It's magnificent. It's a golden color, and I think it comes true in the photographs you alluded to. And I also went over there in the daytime. But Brandenburg Gate, during my lifetime, from 1961 to 1989 especially, was noted for the Berlin Wall and as the dividing line between East and West Berlin. And it was an amazing feeling just walking underneath it and all the history surrounding it. Right next to the Brandenburg Gate, on one side is the German Parliament. On the other side is the U.S. Embassy, one of the most, I imagine, sought-after properties in all of Germany, located on one side of the Brandenburg Gate. And right on the other side of the U.S. Embassy is the Jewish Memorial, a set of stones. And beyond the set of stones is a parking lot. And there's no designation, but that's the place where Adolf Hitler took his last breath. And many believe committed suicide there. And just to see all that in a short span of time, the thing that really stuck out to me as one who promotes freedom at every opportunity, that's the symbol of the Brandenburg Gate brings to me personally. Just standing there and thinking that the wall is down and we have the freedom today, and the Germans do too, and the free world, largely because of the circumstances. As an American who could forget Ronald Reagan call from that spot, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And before him, JFK, I am a Berliner. And that was years after the Berlin airlift, and that's when the communists sealed off the entire city, and only through airlifts did the free part of the city sustain itself. But it's a remarkable place, and to see it at night is particularly spectacular.
Was that your first visit, Fred, to the Brandenburg?
Yes, and it actually followed my trip to Poland, and it was an interesting experience. But on my previous DOD and a lot of my State Department travels, Frankfurt, Germany is a transit spot that I often used to get to parts of Africa and Central Europe and actually Russia and the former Soviet Union countries. So I spent a lot of time not only in Frankfurt, but in working at the U.S. Embassy when it was located in Bonn. It's a beautiful Bonn and Cologne area, spectacular in its own right, taking a train ride up along the Rhine River with the castles on the mountain. I feel like a tour guide explaining all this, but that's
a good thing. Yeah, I mean, that, you can look at pictures, but you don't necessarily get to see it through the eyes of somebody who has got experience in government and has traveled the world. So
Well, my trip to Poland was it was personal, but it was enlightening too, because it wasn't my first trip. My first trip was in the 1980s when I worked for the State Department, and the communists still controlled the country. But the Solidarity movement was blossoming. And I don't know if you recall the name of the Polish priest, Jerzy Popieluszko. He was the father who was murdered by the communists. And I recall on that first trip going over and visiting his gravesite at St. Stanislaus Kostka Church and Cemetery in Warsaw. And only in the city that time, keeping in mind that it was still controlled by the communists, Jaruzelski was still ruling the country. And the Russians had a heavy presence there. But only inside the cemetery grounds, it was amazing. You could see banners, Solidarity, and you realize this is a good trade union movement, because they went back to what I think different parts of our union history was, where they were pro-freedom. And the Solidarity movement recognized a tyrant and recognized domination. And I think between John Paul II, it's St. John Paul II now, and Lech Walesa, I think they rallied the people in the West. And they did something that was heretofore unseen. All the years of military buildup and threats of nuclear war and all the hostile actions that occurred on European soil over the years, we never saw a movement like communism fall with very few gunshots. And
yeah.
As a credit to John Paul II, who rallied every time he would go into Poland to visit, millions of Poles would walk, literally 50, 100 miles just to see him.
Mm-hmm.
And then when that sign of Valenza climbing the fence at the Solidarity, at the Ghanaian shipyard, promoting the Solidarity movement, between those two and setting the spark that set off an explosion throughout the communist world that brought down all these walls is really, really something. So having experienced Poland still under communist domination meant a lot to me. This second trip this past summer was personal from the standpoint because my son-in-law is one of the U.S. soldiers who are over there as part of the NATO force, standing up against the threat emanating from Putin's Russia. And I can't talk any more about that other than tipping my hat to my son-in-law and the other Americans who were there with him, that they make us proud. But in going there, what I had missed out on my first trip to Poland was a visit to the concentration camps, or the death camps as they're better known. And
the Birkenau and Auschwitz.
It's just hard to describe. And do you want me to go into detail?
Yeah, a little bit if you would, because then I want to certainly talk about Oskar Schindler. But Birkenau was really first, correct? Before, it was.
No, Auschwitz
was first. Okay.
Auschwitz one. They're both.
Oh, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Area, yeah. They're considered Auschwitz 1 and 1 and 2.
1 and 2, right?
The concentration or death camps were Heinrich Himmler's idea, the head of the SS, and the person who handled what was considered at the time by the Nazis the Jewish problem was Adolf Eichmann, and then the head of the two camps for most of the time they were in existence from 1940 to 45 was Rudolf Haas. Now, we know what happened to Eichmann several years later. After he escaped Germany. He was found by the Israelis, Assad in Argentina. They brought him back, and he was tried and convicted and hanged in Israel. Yeah. Now, us, what was interesting when we went in, it's hard to describe going through the gates with that famous sign in Auschwitz 1. The sign basically says in English, work will set you free. Little did they know that the people who were being brought in were slave laborers. And there was a pretty good chance that most who went under that sign would never come out again. And we walked through, we saw the remnants of what was there, the whole place. It was a former Polish military barracks, but not a museum, because it had been turned by the Nazis into a death camp. Walking through the barracks and seeing a couple ton of human hair that was shaved off the people who were killed. You see the shoes of the children, mass collection of shoes, suitcases, clothing, and then you go into the places, where they were executed by firing squads. That's in Auschwitz 1. And then finally, the last spot we went into was at the actual gas chamber, which is intact, and the crematorium alongside. It's underground. We went into a gas chamber, and that 700 people died at a time in there or were murdered. it has a feeling that you cannot describe. It's so emotional. And then stepping through the door and seeing the crematorium where the bodies were burned. The only part of some satisfaction after we walked out of the crematorium in Auschwitz I was looking at the spot where the commander of Auschwitz I and II, he was executed 2 years later by the Polish government. They brought him back. They caught him, escaped, and he was on the lam for a year. Then they caught him. He was tried, and then they were sent to Auschwitz to be executed. And he was executed right alongside the crematorium and the gas chamber that he killed so many people. That was at least partial justice. Then we took the ride from there over to Birkenau. And to give you some perspective, Auschwitz I held about 20,000 prisoners at a time. Birkenau, which is located about not quite 2 miles away,
right,
held 100,000 prisoners at a time. And what's remarkable about there is standing in front of what is considered today the gate of death, because the people who went through that main gate, 90% of them never come out alive again. And to stand on the very spot where the human cargo boxcars came in with people, and the men, women, and children were taken off the cars, and they were segregated, and the selection was made on who was healthy enough to live as a slave laborer and who was chosen to die. And the ones who were chosen to die, they just marched them down this one path right to the 2 big gas chambers that were erected in Birkenau in the back by the woods that the Nazis tried to blow up after. Well, they did blow them up after.
Yeah, they tried to destroy the yeah.
But the ground and most of the day in the 2 locations, you could literally feel the spirit of the people who were there, and you could almost hear their cries. And it's my opinion that every human being who can afford it, who believes in freedom, must make a pilgrimage to that place to see how inhuman some people in the human race can be, and how many people it's estimated that 1.3 million people lost their lives or were murdered at those 2 camps from 1940 to 1945, and 90% of them were Jews, and there were Polish political prisoners, Russians, gypsies, and others who were brought in. And it's just a horrifying experience to just put yourself in time and walk through some of the barracks, and you see the boots and churches. This is in the cold part of the world, and they bunked 7 people in a little cubicle, wooden bed at a time. These people were.
They weren't even bunks. They were like slots. They weren't even like a bunk, were they?
Exactly. And they carried. It was easy to, because of malnutrition and other things, they were vulnerable to all kinds of diseases, which spread rapidly. So the ones that were selected to live, their average lifespan was something on the order of 3 months. Before they were worked to death and died. And then the grossest thing I heard on the trip is one wonders what they did with the ashes of so many people. Well, some of the ashes were scattered on the countryside, but the Germans were so efficient at what they did, the Nazis, I should say, that they tried to salvage everything that was worthwhile. They tricked the people to go in the gas chambers. I'm sure everybody's aware of that. They told them they were just going to get a shower, leave their bags in one spot, and they'll be able to come get in. And so there wasn't hardly any resistance at all. And they were moved into the gas chambers, and after they were executed, they brought them out. They removed the fillings. At the time, wealthy people had gold fillings. The Germans methodically went through and removed that, and melted them in the gold bars. They removed the hair. They took the ashes, and this is one of the worst things, and they mixed it with human waste, and they shipped it back to Germany, is what our guide told us, for fertilizer. And if that's true, and that's what we were publicly told over there, that's horrible. The only other, one of the most horrible things I heard, and I think as Americans, we think the D-Day and the glory and, the sacrifices, too, that American soldiers made. And I don't want to but diminish our sacrifice. We still have 100,000 troops still buried in Europe,
Yes.
trying to save Germany and the French and the Belgians and the other countries that have Nazi domination. But you wonder why the Allies, and there's evidence, and I have a book I bought it off. I was just glancing through before I called you, and there's a Los Angeles Times article in 1944 where the Polish resistance was desperately trying to tell the Allies what was going on in Auschwitz, at the Auschwitz camp, and the other sub-camps all over Poland and some other countries. And the Allies did basically nothing. And that's a dark spot in American history. And I want to put it in perspective. The sacrifices of the United States of America, its allies in liberating Europe, is one of the most magnificent accomplishments. But in war, things happen. And one would like to think that when you realize that Auschwitz was selected as the death camp because there were a lot of railroad lines from all of Europe that went through there.
Yeah.
And why didn't the Allies bomb some of the rail lines?
Good
That's
question.
an nagging question. Yeah, and that's something I would encourage your listeners to just probe a little deeper on that one and find out, and because it is a blot, I think, on the tremendous sacrifices we made during World War II, not only in the Atlantic Theater, but the Pacific Theater. But it's a blot on our record, I think. And one of the excuses given that I heard is they didn't want to kill the prisoners. And yet, when you think 1.3 prisoners in those camps were killed, I'm not sure. I think, if they blew up some of the railroad tracks, they might have helped
been able
save
to
a
escape,
few
or
lives.
I hear you.
Yeah,
You don't
but
know.
You can't change history. You
No.
can't change history. It's part of history, and it's just one of those things one doesn't realize until you're in the camps and you start looking and trying to answer the question why. I think we know why the Nazis did it, but we don't know why the Allies were reluctant to be a little more aggressive at the time. But eventually, they were liberated, thankfully, and I think the camps are museums now for all free people to visit and see. And
As
I
they
think
should.
the Holocaust Museum in D.C. is another fine place to go to remember. But I know it's had a personal effect on my life, just going there and paying homage to all those that died. And I'm one of those now that, you never want the world to forget what happened there. And a lot of people don't want to.
Don't even want to. You don't even want to approach it. There's a picture of you standing at Oskar Schindler's desk, and I kind of want you to help us straighten that out, because the movie Schindler's List had a lot of Hollywood license to it.
Yes.
there really wasn't a list, right?
Mm-hmm. So there was a list. No, I one of the photos, I don't know if I posted it on Facebook or not, but I was standing out right on the factory, the enamel factory,
Yeah.
factory in Krakow, is a picture display of a lot of the Jewish people he saved, the people who actually worked in the factory. And all told, there were 1,200. They came from the concentration camp on the other side of town. And Schindler, it's an interesting story, and a lot because it won so many Academy Awards. And one of the people, if you haven't had him on the show, you should probably try to get him, is Jerry Mullen.
I've had him on the show, but I haven't had that discussion. But
he spent 73 days there. He's a dear friend, and here's a little side story. My son-in-law and daughter and I, on a Sunday afternoon, decided we wanted to go over there. So we go over there, and the manager at the time said, "The place is already filled. No more can go in." And I was devastated because we had a tight schedule. We were going to Auschwitz the next day. And I pondered for a moment, and then I got this idea. I go on my iPhone, I step back, and I go through my roll of pictures in my iPhone. And there was a picture of Jerry and I at an event together with our arms around each other.
So you pulled us. Good for you.
That's what I did. I showed the lady Jerry's picture, the manager. She came out from behind the counter. She thanked me for showing her. She walked us right over to the door. She said, "You're in at no charge."
Oh, good story.
And because of Steven Spielberg and Jerry Mullen and the rest of the crew, the museum was created because they did a lot of filming in the factory. And it was, just like Auschwitz, it was an emotional experience because it covered the same period of time that the Nazis went into Krakow, and they had a lot of wonderful displays. But Oskar Schindler's life is amazing because he started out as an entrepreneur who tried to make a buck in the beginning, and realizing that he could get cheap labor, actually slave labor, by taking over the one factory. He went in and he saw what was going on. And all of a sudden he connected with his employees. There were 1,200 Jews there working there.
Fred, my time with you is limited. I'm coming to the end here. So thank you for this. And maybe we can get you and Jerry Mullen on at the same time and have this discussion.
Yeah, Jerry would be terrific in giving you the entire story on how it all occurred. But Denise, it was a pleasure. I hope
my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Have a
all
good
right.
day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience, and we'll see you again soon.